Okay, Lynn, I have roughly, I counted them while you were speaking, I have 40 questions here that are from various, and these are institutional questions from Washington, all of which are addressing various elements of the austerity mania, the deficit hawks, and offering various proofs that Social Security, Medicare, et cetera, are not responsible for the federal deficit, and asking for comments on it. I can't help but feel that many of these questions are actually an avoidance of the central issues. So I'm going to go out on a limb and kind of skip over them. Maybe we'll come back to them.
Use both of them.
What?
You're standing on two limbs, so use both of them.
No, I'm not going to talk about Haiti right now, Bob. What I do want to do, though, is address some of the questions that have come in on NWAPA. And, Lynn, this question is from a member of, he's a new member, actually, of this Stanford group, who now serves on a congressional committee as well. And he says, Lynn, you've been talking about Obama, and you've been talking about the economy, and one of the things that you picked up a month or so ago that really captured my attention was the discussion of NWAPA. And I found this to be particularly important because it's my absolutely firm belief that the problem in the economy is a problem that is not going to be addressed by fiscal measures, but that can only be addressed through the creation of jobs and rebuilding our nation's infrastructure. Now, we have a couple of problems, and I want to make sure that I'm thinking about this in the right way. First of all, the obvious problem is that many of the most aggressive pro-infrastructure Democrats, especially in the House, lost their seats. And they were the people who some of us were looking toward as the people who would be the obvious sponsors and proponents of things like NWAPA, high-speed rails, et cetera. So they're gone now, and that is a problem. And obviously, the other problem is the insanity around austerity. And this is especially what I wanted to ask you about, because it is the case that most laymen believe that the federal government has to borrow money in order to spend money. They believe that the interest rate on Treasury securities is set in a market for government bonds, that the markets impose discipline on the government, and that thus, quote-unquote, fiscal responsibility will produce low long-term interest rates for the federal government, while irresponsibility will be punished by higher and eventually intolerable interest rates. Clearly, if that was true, the markets would be terrified by the long-term deficit and interest rate projections that we face now, and no rational investor would buy a 30-year bond at 4% if they really believed any of this. So obviously, this doesn't make any sense. The markets are irrational. And I think that what has gone on over the course of the last several years proves that the markets are irrational, and therefore there's no real reason to address that. However, there is a further reality that I think does need to be addressed, because people do not understand how our government works. And again, I want to make sure that I'm thinking about this in the right way. My contention is that the U.S. government does not need to borrow in order to spend. In the post-gold standard world, the U.S. government spends and the Federal Reserve lends by writing checks. Those numbers then appear in the bank accounts of the payees, and those payees may be government employees, private contractors, or the recipients of Social Security. The effect of the check writing is to create a deposit in the banking system. This is a free reserve. As long as U.S. banks are required to accept U.S. government checks, and I guess that means as long as our republic still exists, then the government can and does spend without borrowing. If this were not true, we would all be speaking German right now. The fact is that if bonds are then issued, that's just a convenience for the banks which prefer to earn interest on their reserves. The extent to which those bonds are held locally or abroad, which is another common source of worry, depends on the U.S. foreign deficit. It has nothing to do with whether the Chinese like our policies. Foreigners hold bonds because just like domestic banks, they like the interest. Additionally, sacrificing Social Security or Medicare to the goal of a lower deficit projection is dumb. It doesn't work. It has no effect. It would be cruel and it would be crazy. The only way to cut a deficit caused by unemployment, and that is what's causing the current deficit, is to create jobs. And right now, that has to be done with a substantial component of private financing, namely bank credit or some substitute for bank credit. And it's a simple fact of accounting. But I think that we have to get some clarity on how the federal government operates, and in fact, how FDR raised the money to get us out of the Great Depression. If we don't resolve this, and I'm asking you the question because I want to make sure I'm thinking about it the right way, if we don't resolve this and resolve it immediately, then the question of NWAPA becomes a moot point, because these nuts will just go into a total frenzy at the mere mention of the price tag for it, regardless of what the payback for it is.
Well, you may find out with these nuts that if they don't get NWAPA through, maybe the nuts will find that the people are eating them. Looking at them from the nutritional value. I mean, the whole thing is hideous. Look, we're living under a world system which was dominated until bad things happened in especially the Vietnam War, in which we lost our sovereignty, or were induced to lose it, by canceling the fixed exchange rate system. Therefore, we created a hyperinflationary process internationally in which we were run by the British Empire. And if you want to blame somebody for it, you have to blame Lord Jacob Rothschild, who was a key agent in this operation of the British monarchy. You have to blame British imperialism. Now, please be a patriot. First rule. So we destroyed our own system, and we said we accept the British system. Now, what are we talking about here? The history of money, of monetarism. What is it? Now, we can deal with monetarism based to get a continuity. You go back to things like the Peloponnesian War, that period. And you have a period in which the collapse of the Persian Empire and other land empire of Asia brought about the secured domination of the Mediterranean region, the littoral and the lands about it, domination by a maritime power, essentially the people who sailed, and most of the transportation that period from market to market was based on ships run by mariners. And the mariner class represented the highest level of general technology existing in civilization at that time. That is, the ability to go, which is the history of maritime culture had been, that during the period of the Great Glaciation, there was much more transatlantic channel traffic than there was at a later point. For example, you could, in the ancient period, the glacial period, you could travel from this area of Gibraltar to the Caribbean in about the same time that Columbus did, with using of sail Navigation methods, same thing. You would make the journey in approximately the same time that it took Columbus to make journeys to the Caribbean. The maritime skills existed at that point, and the major maritime skill was what? Was transoceanic use of star maps, navigation, stellar navigation. So therefore, this continued, and the ability to deliver goods from one place to another within the Mediterranean or otherwise depended upon this method of navigation, maritime culture. And maritime culture was the most advanced technological culture in the world at that time. Now, during this period, what emerged was, as it was all of this Greek material and so forth, the ancient Greek, so forth, records it. There was a development of an imperial system called the oligarchical model. And the oligarchical model divided the population into, some people were called, as in Homer, gods, or in the Aeschylus's dramas, gods. What were these? These were the people who represented this culture, this maritime culture. And they had, because they were cleverer, better educated, or had cultural advantages, they were able to dominate and loot the other people, the poorer people, who were landed people on the periphery. And this continued as a system of society in the Mediterranean up until Charlemagne temporarily broke that by opening up not only the use of rivers for navigating the interior of Europe, but also connecting the rivers by a series of canals. And the European development of the interior of Europe as a form of civilization and technological progress depended upon this system, maritime, internal, riparian system, developed by under Charlemagne, who was the first to develop an internal economy for Europe. We had the same thing in the United States. We took the same idea, the riparian development. Rivers and canal systems became the way which we penetrated the interior of the North America from the coastal areas. So we had a maritime culture. We were a maritime culture on the coast. We also had an interior which went into the Ohio River and beyond through the development of riparian systems. Then we developed something else. We began to develop railway systems, steam-powered railway systems, moving along the banks of canals, like the Erie Canal, which became the New York Central Railway System, or the Baltimore and Ohio Railway. Then we went further from railway systems which went along the banks of canals with the shortcuts to connecting to other canal areas, like Charlemagne. We went to a transcontinental railway system, which was achieved as a result of the impetus provided by the Lincoln administration, and started in the 1820s. Started with the Reading Railroad during the 1820s, which was the first real rail system inside the United States of commercial significance. The same thing happened in Europe. The geopolitical crisis in the world as a whole was the British Empire's reaction against the success of the transcontinental U.S. railway system. It was a revolution in technology. And the British said, if we have, as Bismarck did, and as was done in Russia by Mendeleev and so forth, if you go from the idea of the achievement of what the United States had done by 1875, as picked up by Bismarck in Germany and picked up by Russia, then suddenly you have land-based power is superior to maritime power and strategic power. That is what the cause of the getting rid of Bismarck in the first place and going on to the preparation of warfare from 1890 up to the present time has been always geopolitical warfare. And geopolitics meant maritime control versus land-based control. That's called geopolitics. It's the only meaning for it. So now we've been in a period of geopolitical warfare on this basis. So therefore, the geopolitical warfare then developed the monetary system. The monetary system became a maritime monetary system where international debt in the form of money became the control of the value of currency. Now, there is no relationship, there is no functional relationship between economic value, physical economic value, and monetary value. They don't mean the same. You have money is exchanged for money. You get pay interest on money. The money is actually, the money system is an international system which bridges nations. So nations are now the slaves of whoever controls the monetary system. Okay? Therefore, the answer to this thing is eliminate the monetary system by giving the power of money is returned to sovereign nations. Now, what do you do with that? Then you get sovereign nations to agree on a fixed exchange rate system which protects their sovereignty. The Constitution of the United States was based on the concept of sovereignty. The United States Constitution is based on the idea of that, on a credit system, not a monetary system. And that's our problem. We have to recognize that's what our Constitution is based on, the idea of a credit system as opposed to a monetarist system. We are being ruined by a monetarist system. And what happened is, as long as we had the fixed exchange rate system, before it was destroyed by the prolonged Vietnam War, the Indochina War, the United States sovereignty as a credit system protected the United States and the world against a great hyperinflation. With the elimination of the fixed exchange rate system and the establishment of the Rothschild system, the inter-alpha group, the so-called BRIC, you had the opening for hyperinflationary swindles. Back to British imperialism. Until the United States' success, British imperialism had come to control the world. The power of the United States, as expressed in particular by Lincoln's revolution against the British attempt to destroy us, and by the effect of the Roosevelt, had freed us from slavery to the British system, the imperialist system. The Indochina War depleted the power of the United States and enabled the British system to come in again and take over with the inter-alpha group system as an extension of British imperialism. Our problems today, since 1971, is the role of the inter-alpha group, which controls about 70% of the actual relevant banking activity of the world. That's our problem. So what you have to do is you have to start from the real problem and the real answer to the problem. Reestablish a fixed exchange rate system. Reestablish what Roosevelt set up at Bretton Woods. Go back to it. Impose it. Now what happens? The minute you do that, you find and you put our banks under that kind of control. Then we now have a bunch of bankrupt banks which the federal government is going to protect. These will be commercial banks under a Glass-Steagall standard. Now the federal government will create credit, authorized credit, to make these banks fungible. They will be able to utter credit, they will be stabilized, be protected under federal regulation. We will then turn, and the federal government itself will authorize legislation which will create credit for building the NWAPA system and for the rail systems and other systems that go with making the NWAPA system work and for getting the states back into shape. Those are the objectives. And that's the solution. There is no other solution. We're talking about 30 to 60 years, essentially, of building this project before the full force of it is completed, or will be considered completed. The greatest project that mankind has ever undertaken. This. And that's the way we fix it. All we need to do is take this idea, get people, maybe some nation in Europe like Germany, some others, Russia, China, India, and some other countries, to agree to become partners in this kind of reestablishment of a fixed exchange rate system to eliminate monetarism from this planet. Monetarism is imperialism, and that must be eliminated. And the only way you can do it is by having a system of equitable agreements among sovereign nation states. That's the only way to eliminate imperialism. We are victims of imperialism. Kill imperialism. And you don't have to have perfect neighbors. You have to have neighbors you can live with. There's a difference. If you can live with them and cooperate with them, then you can build upon that cooperation to evolve a system which is more equitable, more beneficial, more just. But you have to start someplace. So you start with an agreement which is an honest agreement. And you build. And the best way to build is to define great projects of long-term, capital-intensive magnitude, which change the planet for the better and create a better situation for humanity. Base it on that. It's that simple. But just do it. Just do it.